I came home 2 hours before sunrise, still wearing my hospital scrubs with someone else's blood dried brown along the cuff, and the moment I stepped into my son's kitchen, I found my daughter-in-law standing in the middle of it with her arms crossed, waiting for me. My grandson's science project was spread across the table, poster board, glue, a half-built volcano, and Rebecca looked at me the way you'd look at something that had tracked mud onto clean carpet. "You reek like a morgue," she said. "I don't know how Daniel expects Tyler to bring friends here when his grandfather smells like death and walks around at 4 in the morning like a ghost." My son stood in the doorway in his bathrobe and said nothing. He looked at the floor instead of at me. I didn't argue. I set my keys in the bowl by the door, the way I do every night, and I went to my room because they had no idea that the tired old man in bloody scrubs standing in their kitchen had already decided, 3 weeks earlier, exactly what he was going to do about all of it. Thank you for being here with me. Before I go further, tell me in the comments what state you're watching from tonight. I read every single one of them. And I'll say this now, the way I always do. Some details in this story have been changed to protect people who don't know they're in it, but the truth underneath it is real, and I think you'll feel that as we go. My name is Robert Hale. Everyone who's worked with me the last 9 years calls me Bob, except the newer nurses who call me Mr. Hale until I tell them to stop. I am 66 years old, and 3 nights a week, I clean and restock the trauma bay at Ridgeline Memorial Hospital on the overnight shift, because a hospital that runs out of gauze at 3 a.m. is a hospital where somebody's father doesn't make it. I don't say that to sound dramatic. I say it because it's true, and because it's the kind of true thing you only understand if you've been the father who didn't make it, in another version of your life, in a room where the gauze ran out. I wasn't always a man who mopped floors for a living. I spent 31 years as a structural engineer, the last 14 of them running my own small firm, Hale and Voss Engineering, out of a 2-story brick building on Larkspur Street that I bought with my own money in 1994 and paid off 9 years early because I have never in my life been comfortable owing anyone anything. We built bridges, not big famous ones, not the kind they put on postcards, but the kind that matter more. Honestly, overpasses in 3 counties, a pedestrian bridge over Miller's Creek that the town named after my late wife, Carol, because she was the one who fought the county council for 2 years to get the funding approved. I signed off on every calculation myself. I walked every site myself, in boots, in the rain, at 6 in the morning, because a bridge with my name on the permit is a bridge I am personally answerable for, and I have never once in my career let another man's laziness become my signature. Carol died 5 years ago. Ovarian cancer, caught late, gone in 4 months. I sold the firm 2 years after that, not because I needed the money. I didn't, and I still don't, which matters to this story more than you'd think right now, but because without Carol coming home to ask me how the Miller's Creek inspection went, the work had stopped meaning what it used to mean. I sold Hale and Voss to my junior partner, a good man named Preston Cade, for a fair price, and I told myself I would spend my retirement fishing and reading and being useless in the good way, the way Carol always said I owed myself after 30 years of never sitting still. That lasted 4 months. I am not built for stillness. So, I took the hospital job, quietly, without telling my son, because I wanted work that used my hands and my back and didn't ask me to think about bridges or Carol or anything else. 3 nights a week, I restock trauma bay supplies. I mop the halls after the day shift leaves them a wreck. I help the overnight techs move equipment that's too heavy for one person. It is not glamorous work. It is necessary work. There's a difference, and I've spent 66 years learning that most people never figure out which one they respect. My son Daniel is 41. He's a regional sales director for a company that sells commercial HVAC systems, and he's good at it, genuinely good. The kind of good that comes from being likable in a room, which was never my gift and which I've always half envied in him. 2 years ago, after his divorce from Tyler's mother finalized and the market got tight, I offered to let him and Tyler move into my house. Not because he asked. He never asked me for anything directly in his whole life. Not once. Which used to make me proud of him, and now, some nights, makes me wonder what exactly I taught him about coming to his own father when things are hard. I offered because Tyler was 8 years old and scared, and I had 4 empty bedrooms and a porch light that Carol always kept burning, and an empty house at night is a specific kind of quiet that I was not, at that point, strong enough to sit in alone. Daniel remarried a year and a half ago. Rebecca is 36, works in marketing for a boutique real estate firm downtown, and from the very first dinner I understood, the way you understand weather coming, that she had looked at my house, Carol's house, the house I built, the additions on with my own hands over 30 years, and seen it as something she had married into, rather than something she'd been given shelter inside of. I don't say that with anger. I say it as an engineer says it. I observed the load-bearing points of the situation, and I understood, early, where the pressure was going to concentrate. The pressure concentrated on me. It started small, the way it always does, the way cracks in a foundation always start small, before anyone with sense checks whether the base beneath them was ever rated for what's sitting on top. Rebecca began referring to my presence in the house as an adjustment we're all making. She started closing the kitchen door when she had friends from her office over, which I noticed because I'd built that kitchen door myself, hung it myself, and I know exactly what its hinges sound like when someone shuts it deliberately, softly, so as not to seem rude, while still making sure I understood I wasn't invited to whatever conversation was happening on the other side. She stopped introducing me to people by name. I became Daniel's father, said the way you'd describe a piece of furniture that came with the house. None of that, on its own, was a wound deep enough to write down. I have lived 66 years and buried a wife, and I do not bruise from small things anymore. But 3 weeks before the night I came home to find her standing over Tyler's ruined science project, something happened that I did write down, in a black notebook I keep in the drawer of my nightstand, the same kind of notebook I used for 31 years to log site conditions, because an engineer who doesn't document what he observes is just a man with opinions, and opinions don't hold up a bridge. It was a Saturday. Daniel asked me to join them for dinner with 2 other couples from Rebecca's office, and I went, because he asked me directly for once, and I wasn't going to waste that. Dinner was good. Rebecca is, whatever else is true, an excellent cook, and I've never pretended otherwise. Somewhere between the entree and the coffee, one of the men, a fellow named Craig, asked Daniel how he was managing everything: the new marriage, the blended household, a teenage stepson relationship still finding its shape. And Daniel, swirling his wine, said, in the particular low voice men use when they want a table full of people to understand they're being brave about something, honestly, it's been a year. Dad's here full-time now, and at his age, with his health, it's basically like having a third kid in the house, except one who doesn't want to be told what to do. The table laughed, gently, sympathetically. Rebecca reached over and squeezed his hand, and the look she gave him was the specific look of a woman being publicly validated in a complaint she'd been making privately for months. I sat there with my coffee, going cold in front of me, and I did not say a word. Not because I couldn't have. I could have told that table that I pay my own health insurance, that I have not asked my son for $1 in the 2 years I've lived under that roof, that I have, in fact, been quietly covering the difference every month, when the mortgage payment came up short, a fact Daniel didn't know I knew. Because I'd seen the bank statement he'd left on the kitchen counter back in March, the month his commission fell through. I could have told them I do not need looking after. I could have told them that at his age, 20 years ago, I was the man other men called at 2 a.m. when a support beam looked wrong on an inspection, because my judgment was the last word between a building standing and a building not standing, and I have never once, in 66 years, been the third kid in anyone's house. I said none of it. I finished my coffee, complimented Rebecca on the dessert, and went home and wrote it all down, word for word, as close as I could remember it, the way I used to log a crack in a support column before it became something worse. Underneath it, I wrote one line: he needs an audience to believe his own story. I am not going to be a prop in it anymore. That was 3 weeks before the science project. The night it finally cracked open all the way, I'd worked a hard shift. A bad multi-car accident had come through around midnight, and I'd spent 2 hours running supplies and helping the techs clear rooms for the families that kept arriving. The specific kind of night that reminds you why the work matters, even when your knees are done arguing about it by 3 a.m. I got home a little after 4, still in my scrubs, too tired to change before I let myself in the back door. The kitchen light was on, which was wrong. Daniel and Rebecca were always asleep by 11. I found Rebecca standing over the table where Tyler's volcano project sat half destroyed, a bowl of red food coloring vinegar tipped and spreading across the poster board, ruining 2 weeks of a 14-year-old's work the night before it was due. She wasn't looking at the mess. She was looking at me, in the doorway, in my scrubs, and something in her face had been building toward this moment for longer than one ruined science project could explain. "You reek like a morgue," she said, and her voice had an edge in it I hadn't heard before, raw instead of polished, the sound of a person who'd stopped performing for an audience because she thought there wasn't one left to perform for. "Do you have any idea what this is like? Coming downstairs and smelling whatever you bring home from that place, at 4 in the morning, every time." I don't know how Daniel expects Tyler to have friends over when his grandfather smells like death and shuffles through the house like some kind of ghost nobody asked to be here. Daniel appeared in the hallway behind her in his bathrobe, and I watched my son look at the floor instead of at either of us. He didn't defend me. He didn't defend her. He just stood there, 30 seconds of silence, stretching out long enough that I understood, with the particular clarity that comes at 4 in the morning after a hard shift, exactly where I stood in that house. I didn't argue. I set my keys in the bowl by the door, said, "Long night for both of us, I think," and went to my room. I lay awake a long time that night, not with anger, but with the specific, settled calm of a man who has just finished the last calculation on a problem he's been quietly working for 3 weeks. I thought about Carol. I thought about the porch light she always kept burning, the one I still keep burning even now, and what it means to keep a light on for people who've stopped believing you're worth coming home to. I want to tell you what I did next, because I think it matters more than the argument itself, and because I think this is the part of the story that might actually be useful to somebody listening tonight who's in a house where they no longer feel welcome. I did not confront Rebecca. I did not sit Daniel down for the speech every father imagines, giving the one about respect, about sacrifice, about all the nights I worked so he could have braces and a college fund, and a father who came to every single one of his baseball games in a suit, still smelling of concrete dust because he'd come straight from a site inspection. I have given speeches like that before, decades ago, to contractors who cut corners. And I learned something from all of them. A man who already believes he's right does not become convinced by volume. He becomes convinced by consequence, delivered calmly, by someone who clearly isn't bluffing. The next morning, I called Preston Cade, the man I sold Hale and Voss Engineering to 9 years ago, and I asked him for one favor, the only favor I've asked him since the sale went through. I asked him to have his office draft, formally and properly, a lease agreement. Not a gift, not an understanding, a lease for the 2 bedrooms and shared common space Daniel, Rebecca, and Tyler had been occupying in my house for 2 years, backdated fairly, priced at exactly 60% of market rate for the neighborhood. Because I am not a cruel man, and I was never trying to punish my grandson for his stepmother's temper. But a lease means something, a family arrangement doesn't. A lease has terms. A lease can be enforced or ended by either party for cause. I also called my accountant, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Judith Farrow, who has managed my finances since I sold the firm, and I asked her to pull together every mortgage payment I had quietly covered over the past 18 months. Every month, Daniel's commission had come up short, and I'd transferred the difference without a word, because that's what fathers do, and because I never once wanted him to feel the specific shame of asking. It came to just under $22,000. I had Judith prepare a simple, clean summary, not to shame him with it, to make sure, going forward, that everyone in that house understood the actual architecture of what was holding their life up, instead of the story Daniel had been telling dinner tables about a burdensome old man underfoot. I gave it 2 more weeks before I said anything, because I wanted to be certain I wasn't acting from anger, only from clarity, the same rule I applied for 31 years before I signed off on any structural report. Anger builds things that fail. Clarity builds things that last. On a Sunday evening, I asked Daniel and Rebecca to sit down with me in the kitchen, the same kitchen, the one I'd hung the door for myself 30 years earlier. Tyler was at a friend's house, which I'd arranged on purpose, because whatever was about to happen needed to happen between adults. I laid 3 things on the table. The lease agreement, signed and dated by Preston's office, ready for their signatures if they chose to stay. Judith's summary of the $22,000. And the black notebook, open to the page from 3 weeks earlier, the dinner party page, Daniel's words copied out exactly as he'd said them. "I want to be very clear about something," I said, and my voice did not shake because I had rehearsed this the way I used to rehearse, presenting a structural report to a nervous county council calmly, with the facts doing the work instead of my temper. "I am not a third kid in this house. I am not a burden being managed. For 18 months, I have been quietly keeping the roof over all of our heads when the numbers came up short, and I never once made either of you feel small for needing it, because that is not who I am. What I will not accept, going forward, is being spoken about at a dinner table like I am an inconvenience you are heroically enduring, while I am, in fact, the reason there was a house for that dinner to happen in at all." Rebecca went white. Daniel didn't move for a long moment, staring at his own words on the page of my notebook, and I watched something in his face break open that I hadn't seen since he was 9 years old, and I caught him lying about a broken window, not anger at being caught, but the particular shame of a grown man realizing his father has seen exactly who he's been. "Dad, I didn't mean," he started. "I know you didn't mean for me to hear it," I said. "That's different from not meaning it." I told them the lease was not a punishment. It was a boundary, drawn the way I'd draw a load line on a blueprint, not because I didn't trust the structure, but because every structure that lasts has clearly defined limits on what it's expected to bear, and ours had none. And that absence was what had let things get this bad. I told Rebecca, directly, that I did not expect her to love me, only to speak about me, in my own house, the way she'd want her own children to speak about her one day. I told them both that the $22,000 was not a debt I was calling in. It was a fact I was simply no longer willing to let go, unspoken. Rebecca cried, not the practiced kind of crying I'd started to recognize from her, but something rawer, the sound of a woman confronted with a version of herself she hadn't examined closely. "I didn't know," she said, "about the money, about the mortgage. I swear to God I didn't know any of that, and I believed her, mostly, because Daniel's face told me he hadn't shared it with her either, which was its own separate conversation the two of them clearly needed to have without me in the room. I want to tell you that everything transformed overnight, the way it does in the stories that end too neatly. It didn't. Grown people don't rewrite themselves in a single Sunday evening conversation, however calm and however documented. But something shifted that night that has held steady since. Rebecca signed the lease without argument. 2 weeks later, she knocked on my bedroom door the first time she'd ever done that, instead of simply assuming I wasn't home, and asked, stiffly but sincerely, if I'd like to come to Tyler's rebuilt science fair presentation. I went. I sat in the second row. When Tyler spotted me, he grinned the way his father used to grin at that age, and for a moment I wasn't the man who smelled like a hospital at 4 in the morning. I was just his grandfather, in the audience, where I belonged. Daniel and I talked more in the month after that than we had in the 2 years prior. He told me things he'd never said out loud, that some part of him had needed to make me small at that dinner table, because some part of him had never stopped feeling small, standing next to what I'd built with Hale, Voss, that turning me into a burden was easier than admitting his father was still, in every way that mattered, the standard he measured himself against and came up short of. I told him the truth back, that I had never once measured him against myself, that watching him build a life of his own, different from mine, had never been anything but a source of pride, and that if he'd only asked me directly, one time, for help instead of performing his struggle for a dinner table full of strangers, I would have given it gladly, the way I always had. I still work my 3 nights a week at Ridgeline Memorial. I haven't stopped, and I don't intend to, because the work still matters to me the way it always has, regardless of what anyone thinks it says about a 66-year-old man with money in the bank. But something is different now when I come home in my scrubs at 4 in the morning. The kitchen light, when it's on, is on because someone left it for me, not because someone's standing under it, waiting to tell me I don't belong in the house I built. Here is what I've come to believe, after 66 years, after 31 years of signing my name to things that had to hold weight or people would get hurt, after losing Carol and nearly losing my own son to a silence I let sit too long between us. Dignity is not something you defend with your voice raised. It's something you defend with documentation, with boundaries clearly drawn, and with the patience to let consequence do the talking instead of anger. I waited too long to speak up in that house, and I understand now that my silence wasn't strength, it was a habit I'd mistaken for strength, and habits like that cost you more than they ever protect. If there is a person in your life who has started speaking about you as though your presence is something to be managed rather than a gift being given, I want you to hear this clearly. You do not owe anyone your smallness. You do not have to raise your voice to draw a line. Write it down, be clear, be calm, and do not wait, the way I waited, for someone to accidentally overhear the truth before you find the courage to say it plainly, in daylight, at your own kitchen table. If tonight's story reached something in you, tell me in the comments what part stayed with you longest. I promise you, I read every one. Share this with someone who's been quietly carrying more than anyone in their own house has bothered to notice. And if you believe, like I do, that family justice doesn't need to be loud to be real, then stay with me, because there is always another story worth telling, and I intend to keep telling them for as long as any of you are willing to listen.